something crops up during today's session, then you could put any more questions that you have into the Q&A box. And so finally, let's begin. And I'm pleased to introduce our three panelists who are going to sort of introduce themselves and their experiences and share their experiences with us today. So this is Jon Elsey in Cardiff, Nikita Kaushal from the American Museum of Natural History, and Erin McClymont from Durham. So that's enough from me. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand over to them. And so here is everyone. Good to see you all. So why don't we start, and perhaps Jon, you're at the top left of my screen, so why don't you start by introducing yourself and basically tell us something about who you are, what you do, and what you in general do with data.
Sure. So hi everyone, I'm Jon. I work at Cardiff University as effectively a research software engineer. So my training is in physics and atmospheric radiation, but I now work at the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Cardiff, which has quite a big geochemistry community. So I typically tend to work with large data sets, doing numerical modeling, curating data for laboratories in our department, and that kind of thing. So I don't have kind of geochemical experience directly, but I work with geochemists to manage their data.
That's great. Perfect. Nikita, why didn't you go next?
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. So I'm originally from India, and then I did my PhD in the UK at Oxford, and I was working on speleothems as an archive to try and reconstruct the Indian summer monsoon at that time. Since then, in addition to the sort of geochemistry and lab work and field work that I was doing at that time, I've also been learning how to make databases of stalagmite data and other archive data, and then how do you use a sort of data-based approach to answer climate questions, and getting into that more. So at the moment, that's what I focus on. So it's using the SciSal speleothem database in order to still address hydroclimate questions, just a different approach. Thanks, David.
Lovely, thank you. And last but not least, Erin.
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I am an organic geochemist, so I work a lot with lipid distributions. My career started doing marine sediments and generating sea surface temperature proxies and productivity proxies. So a lot of practical lab work and trying to manage data in that way. And then over my career, I've been involved in quite a few multi-proxy studies as well, and trying to synthesize data. And more recently, I've been heading up the Pages working group called Pliovar, where we've been trying to integrate and synthesize and interrogate geochemical data from a range of marine sediment cores. So that's involved both creating some databases, or at least creating data that other people can use, as well as trying to kind of incorporate other people's data. And a lot of that has also involved data model comparison. Thanks.
Perfect, thank you. So you can see we have a nice sort of range of experience in inorganic and organic geochemistry, and also in Jon's case, not so much geochemistry, and a bit more on the computing side. So we have about 5 themes that we'll try and cover. The first theme is sort of just down to the nitty-gritty of you collecting your own data and handling your own data. We have a few questions on this topic. So I'll just start with a few of these. A few of these are nice short things to start, probably. So one question says, what statistical tool, so standard deviation, standard error, variance, etc., do you think is best to use to assess data quality? So to report with your numerically measured number, what should you be doing statistically? Do you want to perhaps start, Erin?
Yeah, can do. I think whatever you do, it's really important to include the description of what you did and why. So like the metadata is also important. So for example, we use a lot of measurements of like standard deviations of internal standards that we use, and trying to get a sense of reproducibility within the lab. But then if you're applying data that maybe has a calibration error, I don't think that kind of information is always translated through to our geochemical data. So I think maybe it depends on how you want to use the data. I think for me, I work on a lot of time series data, so I don't tend to have like clouds of data that need to be as kind of statistically interrogated. It's more that I'm plotting data points through time. And for that, we're quite often fairly bad at just not showing the errors at all, because it's single sample analysis. I think maybe spend some time researching which statistics are the best descriptors for what you want to do. So some people use like root mean squared error, for example, or some might use a different approach. I think you have to be familiar with what the statistics can do and what fits your data.
Okay, thank you. Nikita, maybe you want to follow up on that.
It's an interesting thing to think through, and I'll use non-technical terms also because I've never been good at it. But I think the thing is, when you're doing the chemistry, when you're actually drilling the sample and measuring them through the instruments, the three things that would be nice to know is how accurate you are. So how many times you're hitting the actual standard measurement, how much difference is there between your measurement and the standard measurement. That is something nice to report. And the third time is how many times are you able to hit that measurement. So those three things are really nice to report when you are making the actual measurements. The standard itself, it's nice if you can use an international standard or if there is a difference. So for example, you're measuring aragonite samples, but the only standard available to you is a calcite one. That's an interesting one to report because that will involve a correction. It's not something that's often reported. Those bits are really good. For the rest of it, like once you move beyond the measurement of your own sample and you're looking at large databases or just large scale time series analysis of samples, you have to keep plotting. You have to keep plotting, keep looking at the time series data, and then you can try a bunch of different statistical things. So just the normal distribution of things. If there are outliers, there is no other way except spending a long time with your data set and getting to know the data set. And it's a really important thing that you don't want to miss in the beginning.
Yeah, right, to spend time with your data. And I don't know if, Jon, if you had anything you wanted to add at this point?
Yeah, I don't have anything kind of related to the geochemical side of things. I'm sure you have different analyses and statistical techniques that you tend to use in your own domains, but I would say in general, as Erin pointed out, making sure that you just document everything, making sure you have all your metadata so that when it comes to, for example, constructing uncertainty budget, you know what your errors are, whether they're random errors or they're systematic errors, so that you can actually construct a cohesive uncertainty budget, which is understandable by people you want to share your data with in the future. And all of these things that Nikita said as well are really important for kind of building that uncertainty budget. So yeah, I'd say that it really is quite field dependent, but kind of just make sure that whatever it is that you do, you kind of break it down and you document exactly what you did and you include all of that in wherever you send that data in the future, whether it be a paper or a repository, whatever.
All right, perfect. And sort of related to that, another question, how many decimal places, stroke significant figures are relevant to report for isotope data? So we've got back to one or two of the geochemists here then. Nikita, do you want to go next?
This is so interesting because it can be so variable. I would say it depends on the international standard. So whatever is a sensible way of comparing against the international standard, because eventually that's what people are going to be doing. So if the international standard says that you can get up to 4 digits after decimal, whatever, then report your data in the same way, but it would depend on, because you're comparing to something that's a standard. So that would determine it, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. Erin, did you have?
Yeah, I was going to say the same as Nikita. I think to add to that, we've had some discussions here sometimes where people have reported, I don't know, 9 decimal places or something for a measurement. And when you then calculate what that 9th decimal place might mean, you could be down to atomic scale or something, which really, are we that accurate? So I think yeah, look at your instrument, look at your reproducibility and look at the standards, and yeah, maybe don't overpromise. If 2 decimal places is where your data are most robust, then stick to it. It doesn't do anything to add the 3rd one just because it's there in your spreadsheet.
Yeah, absolutely. So sort of take consideration of what your uncertainty is, what your error bar might look like, and don't report an excessive number of figures beyond that, especially if you're writing that in the text of a paper as well, because that becomes very hard to read. Yeah.
I think I would also quickly add, you get to you get to that kind of decimal only when you do something like you've made the same measurement 3 times and you're taking an average of it. And the Excel will then spit out 5 digits after decimal, which is not what you measured in the first place. It's a factor of averaging some other numbers, which isn't a real number after that. So yeah.
Yep. And Jon, any other wisdom?
No, not really. I was just going to echo basically what you said, David. So yeah, that was pretty much what I was saying.
Perfect. Alrighty. So what about okay, you've got, say, an individual analysis run for, let's say it's a time series, a dozen different samples, and you've got isotope data, and you've measured those on one day, but you're doing a PhD and you work for 3 or 4 years. How would you go about combining that data or compiling that data across sort of a full compilation of your PhD work, basically? Who wants to go on that? Who wants to come in on that?
I can start and just say what we've done here is that a lot of the time what I work with are alkanones, which it's a ratio of 2 particular organic compounds, and it gives a value, a sea surface temperature value. And one way that we've tried to check for the reproducibility over time is that we inject a standard into every one of our runs on the instrument. And what that allows us to do is not only do we add kind of industry standards which tell us if the instrument's behaving well, but we also see if something's happened during our method, or if the instrument is perhaps misbehaving and what impact it's having on our standards. So I think if you can plan your lab work to incorporate standards that can be seen as reproducible, that's really helpful, and to keep them and rerun them if you want to. We've certainly had instances where maybe the instrument has drifted one day, less so with the alkanones, but when we've worked with photosynthetic pigments, if your detector starts drifting, which it will do, your data can be very different from one day to the next. So yeah, you need to have those standards, and then you need to decide, do you correct for the drift, or do you perhaps do some instrument maintenance and rerun them when you're happy with them?
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks. Nikita?
Yeah, I would say the same. It's really helpful to have international standards, but it's also really helpful to have internal laboratory standards, which are more matrix matching. So if I'm working on stalagmites and if the standard happens to be a marble or something, it is helpful if I have an internal stalagmite standard against which I'm checking stuff. This is something just developed by the laboratory and internal, but running a bunch of standards right in the beginning, especially when the instrument is shifting from, say, measuring corals to measuring stalagmites or something, like where you've changed the material that you're running through the instruments. It's really worth doing batch standard runs a little bit, also because you really don't want to lose your sample. It's a pain to run all of the samples and then realize that you've got a mistake because of the instrument running there.
And would you associate the sort of standard quality when you're compiling this data? Would you associate like a flag for data quality based on the standards, or the standard value measured within a given run as part of that kind of compilation when you're pulling together all the data from each session?
Yeah, that's interesting, because also it's a bit of these laboratory hygiene kind of thing, right? Like where you're saying that all of the data that you measure will be on a computer somewhere, which means when you're doing the compilation, you have to go back to that original instrument measured, not the standard corrected final measurements. It's really worth going back to the original data sets and seeing what standards were used, and if you also change which standard you were correcting against between the data sets, if that's making any difference, things like that. Yeah, I cannot, I feel like I always come back to this, but you have to keep staring at your data. It's the only way to kind of make sure you're accurate. But usually these are set out by the laboratories, or at least like for us, it was best practices of the laboratory going, if you're doing this final big compilation, you go back to the original measured data and make sure you're being quite consistent about the standards and things.
And Jon, do you have thoughts on sort of compiling data from lots of individual runs into a big kind of compilation?
Yeah, I would say that the most important thing is documenting everything you do. So when you talk about your standards and things like that, if you're running against a certain standard, include that information wherever you put your initial data set, so that when you look back on it in a year's time, when you've been doing your PhD and you're writing up and you're like, what on earth was I doing here? you can say, oh, I've done this. This might have a certain level of precision or accuracy, whatever, based on the fact that we measured to this standard at this temporal resolution. In terms of kind of compiling and combining data sets, it obviously depends on how good the kind of organization is going in. So having a protocol for how you collect your data, how you incorporate your metadata and documentation into those kind of file structures, if that's consistent, it makes it a lot easier to then compile that all into something in the future. So it's worth investing the time into kind of creating a pipeline, as it were, where you might put a sample in, you do some reference measurements, you get the data out, you put that data somewhere, you create the metadata, you create READMEs, documentation, upload your lab books, whatever, into that file, in that folder, and then hierarchically organize it with consistent file naming so that you can ideally in future automate the process of combining it into a single data set in the future. It's all about just maintaining that consistency and making sure that you stick to your kind of protocol if you have one.
Right, yeah, thanks. So that moves us on towards almost our next topic, really. So you've already sort of taken us there, which is thinking about managing large data sets. So more than just sort of an individual one or two that you could kind of just do very, very readily. And one interesting question is, so what is your view on, if you like, standardizing a lab's output versus each user having their sort of individual own style of spreadsheet structures way of compiling their data? So should you, as a PI, should you be asking your PhD students to do everything in the same way, or should we have this sort of individual approach to analyzing and compiling your data?
I mean, I'm biased, but I would definitely say having a standard is a lot better than everybody having their own individual means of analyzing it. Particularly, for example, if you have work which is kind of building on a previous student's work, or you take that work into like a postdoctoral role for a different person, and then you've got to kind of manage different standards and different data organization structures and all this kind of stuff. It becomes incredibly complicated. Having a consistent standard is just going to improve everybody's lives, even though it takes a bit of time to maybe get used to or to create the standard in the first place. I think it's just a much better thing to do. So if you don't already have one, I would kind of consider making one. And it might be that you create your own standard and then you try and get your colleagues to do it if you don't have a kind of consistent one already, or something like that. But yeah, that's probably my perspective as a kind of data curator rather than a laboratory person.
Yeah, interesting. I was seeing some nodding there. I'm seeing here going, I'm not sure what I do, but so Nikita, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I agree 100%. Like, I feel like if there is an instrument, it's really helpful, of course, if there is a lab manager who's sort of centrally kind of following things, but also it's really helpful if at the outset that instrument data is produced in a similar, consistent way. It doesn't matter who's using and for what measurement, but if it's similarly consistent. The other bit is you always have to reduce data that is measured by the instrument. You're correcting it for different things. You're reducing the data. As a PhD student or master student, it's really good to do it manually because you can see all of the different corrections that go into it, your drift correction, your whatever, but you can see all of them. But at some point, for getting really correct data, it's really worth making it automatic, like automatizing it, even if it's just Excel spreadsheets or whether you're using code. But it reduces a lot of manual error if at some point you can automatize it. So it can be a mixture of both. You take students through it to teach them everything that is involved, but you then double check by making it auto. Yeah, just reducing the data is a more of an automatic process.
Yeah, I know that's a great perspective, I think, because that training and understanding and fiddling with data yourself is really important, right? But then normalizing it so that your data is comparable to other students or other researchers sounds valuable. And
just less manual errors with also things like decimal points, like how many decimal, like it just controls all of that in a really nice way. So,
Erin, do you have thoughts on that as someone who's probably had to do this with students? And
yeah, well, I was just thinking, I don't think we have standard templates actually in our group, but what we do have is so I give everyone when they start an example of one of my spreadsheets and say, this is the kind of thing you need. So you need the sample name, the mass of the standard, and these are the lipids that you're going to look at. I think sometimes how people then play with the data it can be a personal preference. Do people want to do ratios or import it to PCA or something like that? But one thing we found really hard when we did the Pliocene synthesis was that people named things in different ways. So when we were compiling kind of literature that was in public databases and things, and I have tried to find here a way that we all at least call everything the same thing, because some people might write, I don't know, alkanone concentration, but some people might write K37 concentration, and that might sound really simple and not a problem. But if you're wanting to do something like an automated synthesis, or you want to understand, does the column from this spreadsheet mean the same thing as the column in another spreadsheet? You don't actually know without then having to go and dig through the metadata. So I think sometimes thinking about the labels that you use in your spreadsheets is also important. So with Pliavar, what we ended up doing was actually creating our own template, and it had headers that were readable in R. And the idea was that people would then copy and paste their data into that readable format, and that made a huge difference for being able to pull the data you wanted in. So I think, yeah, we don't have a strict template, but I suspect by me handing the team spreadsheets and saying, well, this is an example of mine, that might have introduced a bit of standardization. But until recently, I haven't had more than one person working on the same project at a time. So it also hasn't really ever come up before. I suspect it's going to come up now, now that we have 4 people generating similar data. So maybe I should, have a chat with them about their data management.
Great. So there's a question in the Q&A which sort of relates to this, which is more along the lines of when using large geochemical, often disparate geochemical data sets, you have sort of multiple different methods of analysis. You may or may not have reference material, certified information. How can you include these different record or different data into a database while still incorporating some level of sort of quality control? So, I guess the example could be alkanone data and magnesium calcium data and all sorts of different geochemical proxies for temperature. How can you include those into one database?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's I'd be interested to hear how Nikita's done it with the Sisal, because in Pliavar, essentially, we had the benefit of there having been some interlab comparisons, which had demonstrated that the impact of specific laboratory approaches should not have a big impact on the data you have. It's still an uncertainty that we don't always fully check. Effectively, we didn't take it into consideration at all. We didn't flag anything as high or low quality because we were interested in compiling everything that was published and then trying to create a global synthesis of data that previously hadn't been put in one place. I think in then interrogating the data, we did have some sites that we did make corrections to, but again, we laid it all out why we did it. One thing that made that possible is that people provided the raw data into the databases. So we were able to go back and say, okay, how did they clean it? And what correction did they use? What happens if we take that correction off? Or what happens if we apply a new calibration that has emerged since this paper was published? So it wasn't specifically about using a quality control on the data. We kind of had to accept that if the data was published, it should be usable. One area of science where I know that can be quite important is with the ice core analyses. So I think, and maybe this is similar for the speleothems, I think for some of maybe it's the cations and anions that they measure, I think the type of instrument that they use can actually affect the quality of the data or the intensity of the signal. So I think I could imagine there being a quality control flag needed. But is that something you've come across, Nikita, with the speleothems?
Yeah, I have to say, till the last version of the database, it was really straightforward because we were only dealing with oxygen-carbon isotopes. And there it's such a workhorse of geochemistry that arguments are fairly settled. But this version of the database has got trace elements. So it's got magnesium, strontium, barium, and so on. So then you come to a lot of decisions. Do you give it as ratio data? Which units should you use? And all of these kinds of things. So this time there were a lot of discussions around just what goes into the database or not. So I think it's almost stepwise. Like you're kind of looking at a publications methods section, but for it to go into the database, you have to make all of that machine readable. So then it suddenly becomes lots of metadata for one single data field in a way that was not required for oxygen carbon, because they all have different reference materials and different instruments on which you measured, whether you measured it as a ratio or calculated the ratio afterwards. So just lots of metadata from the methods section that has to become a machine readable metadata field, which took a long time to do. And the other bit was, we'll come to this later, I think, because it's one of your topics, but when you're doing data model comparisons, for somebody who's doing modeling, they may not necessarily understand the nuances of all of this. So if there isn't a straight up quality flag going, use this data because this is excellent quality, don't use this data, they're just going to use it. They're just going to use all of the data. So then what the SciSal working group does is, usually the working group itself will produce papers saying that we think that this data is better for higher resolution studies for such and such a reason. If you're looking at glacial interglacial changes, it's okay. Like the uncertainty on it is not going to matter. You can kind of use these data. So, but they are entire publications rather than a machine readable thing flag going use or don't use this data. There's a lot of discussion around that, whether we should do the flags or not. We've tried to stay away from that because, again, some data you cannot use for abrupt events, but on glacial, interglacial, you could use the data. There's nothing wrong with the data in that sense. And sometimes it's dictated by the core. It's not necessarily the instrument you're using. So it's a shame to lose on that information. So yeah, like Erin says, like it can be dealt with. It's not straightforward. But especially when you come to databases, which are getting created by measurements from different laboratories and things, you really do have to think through it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about kind of what it's being used for. Even the data could be great, but the age model might be different, and what's the time scale that you're caring about and what questions you're asking can determine that as well. Great. So one last question on sort of large data sets, and we'll come to Jon, I think, for this one, is basically what advice do you have for storing / accessing data on servers, and sort of good tips for backing up data sets?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So in terms of storing them, ideally, if your university has a research data store, then that is going to be the absolute best place to put it, because typically they will have offsite backup, they will have mirroring, they'll have all these kinds of things, so that you can effectively upload your data to somewhere where it can be read by other people, and you don't have to worry about the backing up, because that's should be done for you by your institution. Other ways you can do this are you can use repositories like Zenodo for uploading data, which is below a certain size. I think it's like 50 gigabytes or something. And then that data is citable. It is available publicly if you're assuming you want this data to be open source. And I think that's just a much better way of doing it than trying to kind of put it on a server somewhere and then having to worry about backing it up and that kind of thing. So what was the first part of the question, if you mind repeating that, just so I lose my train of thought?
Yeah, I mean, so what advice do you have for storing or accessing data on servers? So I guess you were saying use university sort of institutional.
Yeah, if you have infrastructure in place that can handle that, then I think that's the best way to go. Alternatively, online repositories are really good. You might have a kind of, like a lab server that you can store data on. And then it's a matter of organizing that data in a kind of coherent way, learning the best methods to extract that data as well, of course, in future. The ones we have at Cardiff, for example, we have a kind of Windows interface staff can upload their lab data into. It's like a Linux-based server, Alternatively, you could learn how to use the command line and use tools like rsync, which are really effective for obtaining this kind of data from kind of your own servers. So yeah, I think that's what I'd say about that. If anyone else wants to jump in, feel free.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. So we'll move on to think about, have a couple of questions, a little bit along the lines of data interrogation, data interpretation, statistics. So one example, how can we interpret geochemical data using statistical tools like PCA, so principal component analysis? And there's a second question along these lines as well. How should I approach geochemical data set to test its statistics? So I guess sort of statistical significance of a data set and sort of PCA with sort of geochemical data sets to analyze it. Who wants to start on that?
I don't mind starting just with some experiences that we have recently. So we are working a lot at the moment with XRF data. So it's scanning cores. So we get for every like millimeter down a core, we get elements, maybe 10 to 15 elements recorded. And there can be a natural inclination to plot it all and to, we generate all these wiggly lines down core data, but it's actually quite hard then to distinguish what's related or not, and hard to see maybe where the big events or changes are. So what we've been using principal component analysis and clustering to try to identify, which elements are related to each other, but also which ones are giving us quite different signals. So we might have a couple of elements which tell us, they might cluster together and say, this is really a mineralogic input to this sediment. And then some other elements which appear to be more biogenic, associated with biological material and productivity, for example, in the water. So we found that really helpful because then as well, you can use the cluster analysis to identify like zones or areas where the geochemistry of your samples is changing. And that's really helped us, I think, to say, okay, instead of me looking at a trend line down through my site, actually, where is the change? Like, where's the most significant change in all of these records? What it's also allowed us to do is not feel that we have to plot and present everything. So there are some elements where nothing really happens and it's just like background noise. And so we don't then worry about trying to interpret that and maybe over-interpreting it. Something that's quite interesting for principal component analysis is that you can also then say your principal component 1 is being pulled in two directions by quite different groups of elements. You can also then plot down core the value of principal component 1. And we've used that, for example, as a record of mineralogic versus biogenic input. So you're kind of averaging the information, you're incorporating lots of information, which maybe initially doesn't seem very intuitive. Why do we measure all these elements if then we're just going to combine them? But actually, I think the strength sometimes is in the combination of the signals. Some other analysis that we've done recently, which might be particularly of interest to those doing down core time series, is we've been working on change point analysis, where you identify like the statistically significant point at which your time series changes. And these techniques have been around for a while. There's one called ramp fit as well, where you can put running means through your data. But I think having that statistical approach just gives you a bit more confidence. Like, am I seeing this, or am I like over-interpreting this data? So yeah, we've used things like that, and obviously time series analysis and looking at leads and lags between records can also be really effective with geochemical data. I think you still have to interrogate your data, as we said earlier, and really understand your data. But sometimes it can be easy for us to, I think, see patterns where, we're desperate to see something happen. But using things like PCA can be really helpful for disentangling that in a complex record.
Thanks. Yeah, there's some great suggestions there for people. Nikita, do you have any more statistical things you want to add? So you've played with a few of these, I'm sure.
Yeah, those are all really good points. And again, I've never been good at statistics. It's stuff that I've been picking up as I need it for my work. So maybe I can give more anecdotal things. But So this time for this project where I've been using this data-based approach, one of the things that I've tried to do is actually stay away from reading the discussion in publications, because what I want to do is to interrogate my database and see if it comes up with a consistent result where I'm not colored by what the original authors have said it's likely to be. So then that's part of this thing of like, how do you use data-based approaches in order to interrogate a database without returning to what methods you used to use when you had a single time series. So for example, if you say like, okay, aragonite stalagmites are more common where there's a dolomitic lithology. That's something that we think about when we're doing field work, and it's something that is stated in papers without necessarily having a citation next to it, because it's something that is understood, that has been built up over years, but nobody knows who said it the first time or who actually found the results. So like now when you interrogate the database, you go like, okay, how many dolomite lithologies have got aragonite stalagmites? And then I use the database to ask that question. And then you kind of see the results. So it's I'm not answering the question in terms of statistics, but it's just saying like your way of doing data analysis, if you use a larger database, can be different from how you do it if you were looking at a single site that you know really well. And the time series, the second bit is if you're working on paleoclimate data, a lot of your statistics surrounds time series, like Erin was pointing out as well. So one of the things you can think about is standardizing age depth models. So not everybody might use the same method for doing an age depth model. It's nice that we have so much choice now. So one of the big things that the SciSal database did is to run all of the time series through 6 popular age depth models. So when you are looking at something like change point analysis, we actually don't have to account for uncertainty resulting from an age depth model, because I'm going to use the same age depth model across all of the time series. So that's a nice way to do it. Again, this is something Erin said, like, how do you make sure that what you're seeing is actually there versus what you want to see? And part of it can also be multi-proxy approaches. So you make sure that the signal is consistent across multiple proxies, or kind of makes sense for the environment or the climate you're trying to interpret. And one is a bit of skills based. Like everything I've learned through summer schools. And so, for example, where Erin said something like RAMFit, like, so Manfred Muddelsee and other professors that come up with, who are statisticians rather than geologists like me trying to do statistics, they do really fantastic summer schools that you can just attend online, that are free. Their softwares are free. You can just use them online. It really helps to talk to other people. They're super focused on time series analysis and things like that. So they're really worth looking out for and doing.
Yeah, it's another cool idea. Yeah, thanks. Jon, do you have anything to sort of add on top?
No, not really. All the stuff I was going to talk about with regards to PCA, Erin covered pretty much. It's just a great tool for kind of being able to intuitively interpret your data when you've got lots of dimensionality to it. Just being able to look at 1 or 2 key bits and working out what those actually mean is just a really fantastic tool. So yeah, that's all yeah.
Perfect, thank you. One last quick question before we move on to the next topic. How would you deal with, and I guess the question is, are there any challenges with things such as an enrichment factor or these calculated sort of derived quantities that are sensitive to the normalizer, so to what you put on the bottom of what you're dividing by? Are there any challenges for these kind of derived proxies? Who wants to jump in on that? Maybe Erin, do you have anything to say there?
Yeah, I'm not sure, because I think with a lot of the geochemistry that I work with, we don't really use that. I mean, I guess the only time where I can see that happening is sometimes when we have to normalize our biomarker accumulation rates or concentrations, where we normalize them to total organic carbon. So for that, we're trying to correct for like changes in sedimentation rate, changing how much carbon is stored, or how much has been buried and how much has been lost. Yeah, we don't tend to look at really like enrichment factors and those kinds of issues in the work that I do, I'm afraid.
That's all right. Nikita, do you want to say anything at all, or shall we move on?
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat. It's not something that we have to think about much. The only level at which I can think about is at the standard. So we usually use dilution so that we are normalizing to the same amount of calcium as you would normally find in calcite or aragonite stalagmites versus some other kind of material. And second is when you're doing laser ablation, there actually aren't as many calcite laser ablation standards. So you could be normalizing to a standard that doesn't have the same matrix, that is not a calcium carbonate matrix, that's glass or something like that. And you're kind of, but that's the only level at which we do it. We don't have to think about it otherwise.
All right, yeah. I guess it's a case of sort of being a bit aware. It's a bit like a standard that you're using when you're saying this is a crustal composition, this is enrichment above a crustal level, being a bit aware of what you're, whether you need a local or a global value for that comparison, etc. Is probably quite important. All right, great. So we'll move on to think about, and you alluded in one of those answers to this already in a way. So we'll talk about open access databases. So general question, I've measured some geochemical data and someone's asked, how can I add my data to geochemical databases or repositories? So I guess here we're maybe thinking outside of your lab's database, you're thinking a bit more globally. Nikita, do you want to jump in on that?
Really funny because the reason I was saying this is also because, so adding it to a university repository is really important because it's a backup system. So, but knowing why you're putting your data and for what purpose then becomes really important. So acknowledging that if you're putting it on your university repository, even if it is open access to everybody and has a DOI and it's what you put in your publication, it will largely always be for your own backup. Sort of, when I'm working on the database, you have to imagine that there are, I think it would be the same for Plyovar as well, but there are 30 or 40 early career researchers who are digging through databases, trying to find your data so that they can then standardize it and put it into a format, and nobody's getting paid for this. It's all free work that is put in by people. So if your aim of putting out your data somewhere is so that it is more findable for future research work, what you really want to do is kind of look at what your community does in general to make your data more findable. This could be putting it on NOAA, or it could be that putting it on lipid, or it could be engaging with the community. So engaging with SciSal if you're working on speleothems, engaging with coral hydro 2K if you work on corals and so on. You have to engage with the community and really put in time to submit your data set to them. I can promise that it is worth it because you get authorship on database papers, you get involved in your community, you start to learn things like using databases for questioning, for research questions or data model comparisons, just much more advanced techniques on the data direction, if that is of your interest. So yeah, I would say like for doing that, your first question to yourself needs to be like, why are you putting your data out? Is it just because the journal says you have to be fair, then you submit it to Zenodo, get a DOI overnight and you're done? Or whether it is because you want your data genuinely to go farther than that immediate research project that you worked on.
Yeah, those are really good points. Yeah, and sort of thinking about the purpose and also engaging and going a bit beyond just putting it there and hoping that something happens to it. Erin, did you have thoughts on this? I'm sure you must do.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, yeah, the biggest struggle we had with Plyovar, well, and even in just kind of my individual work, trying to plot data alongside my data, you know, when I was interrogating my own data, was just finding the work. You know, you see it in a paper and then you can't find it. So I think, you know, I started my career when journals didn't require you to put your data anywhere. And some people put their data in a like table in the back of the paper, but at least you could manually type it out. But it's definitely better now that I think most journals require that data to be available. But I agree with Nikita that yeah, it could just be an individual link, but then someone's got to come and find it. And I think one advantage with the NOAA, and I use the Pangea database a lot for the paleo work, is that they have staff who will also check it and will say things like, oh, you know, you haven't given the latitude and longitude to the right number of decimal figures. Like, actually, where is this site? Or they can also, one thing that was really good with our recent Pliocene upload was that they also were able to make links in our database to all the other data sets in the repository that from, say, the same core sites or, you know, the original data sets. And so I think that can be really, really helpful. I think you have to consider, like, what's the point in me generating all this data if no one can ever find it? And if you want people to use it, then I think going to those like community databases is a really good strategy. And you'll really get a feeling for that by looking at people's papers and where they are publishing, and conferences and so on. Yeah, I'm not sure of, you know, the wider range of databases which are out there. We used a Pliocene specific website that we set up for the databases, but we used that to put things on like quality, well, like gold, silver, bronze medals according to sort of age models and things like that, which there just wasn't the capacity to do in Pangea. But that was more like extra information if people were interested. We really felt that we had to get our outputs in something like Pangea to make sure that the community could download it and use it easily.
In a related question, and we'll bring Jon in for this one, sort of for these kind of databases, what would you sort of recommend as software to deal with databases? So if you're compiling a database, for example.
That's a good question. That will entirely depend on the size of the data set you're generating. If you're just generating kind of, you know, you've done some lab work and it's like going to be on the order of some megabytes rather than gigabytes, then keeping it simple is generally best. So even just in things like CSV files with metadata in separate files can be really useful. But then as the size of your data increases, the level of complexity that you need to introduce can get bigger. So in my specific field, atmospheric science, we have a standard called NetCDF, which is used for kind of spatiotemporal data. So if you have kind of large data sets, which over a large domain and have long time series, then that's a really useful format because it includes metadata. It's basically, you can download a NetCDF, you can slice from it, you can take subsets of it in both time and space very easily. Then as you go bigger than that, if you're looking at really big data sets, then you might need to start looking at something like Hadoop or Spark or some kind of, you know, large parallelized data management database software. But really it depends on the kind of data that you're working on, I would say. Kind of have a look at what the standards are in your field, and kind of work with those. The most important thing is to be consistent with what other scientists like you are doing. And if you're using something which is completely different to everybody else, then that makes it much more complicated. And also the other thing is to make sure you include all of the relevant information, again, harping on about metadata, but just including every single thing that you think is going to be required for somebody to actually use that data. Not just to find it, but also to be able to interpret it, to know exactly what each of your, for example, columns might mean. The amount of times I've worked with people where I've downloaded a file and they've got some variable called row or file something with no units. And it's like, I'm sure if you're somebody in that specific field, you know what that is, but I have no idea what it is. Just having information like that can be really important, I think, for kind of managing these open source data sets. So hopefully that vaguely answers the question anyway. But it really does depend.
No, that sounds like some good suggestions.
Sorry, David.
Yeah, go for it.
Jon said more because like I engage less with the construction side, but more with using databases. And I think it's one of these things I wish I'd known at the start of my PhD is learn Python. Like, because Python is probably the software that people use most to interrogate or interact with the database. It's also where a lot of the time series analysis advancements are being made. PaleoClim is a really good package if you're into this field because it's very specific, specifically focused. They have really cool paleo hackathons that are based on this package that will let you do everything and really, really quickly.
If I can harp on again, back onto that as well, is that just learning Python in general is just the most useful transferable skill that you can possibly have, I think. Everything we talked about with regards to constructing data sets, compiling data, all of this can be automated in a Python framework. If you know how to use Python, you can automate the process of collecting your data, putting it into the formats you want, uploading it to where you want it to go, analyzing that data, visualizing that data. All of that can be done with that one tool. So if you don't already know how to use it, I would highly recommend it. It's incredible.
And I think perhaps that probably a few of the things you've been saying there, Jon, about these formats and use of Python and things, perhaps helps with the question in the chat there along the lines of sort of tips for working on the relationship between spatial and temporal components of data sets. I suspect that probably helps answer that. So yeah, I think with time's flicking by far too quickly. So let's move on to our last theme, which is data model comparison. So obviously you've measured some data, but modelers out there want to understand sort of paleoclimate patterns or processes, or understand mixing in the mantle or something like this. So let's see, got a couple of questions. What should data generators best do to make lives easiest for modelers?
Shall I start?
Yeah, go for it.
So I've had to do this a few times. Well, ask them what they want is one way to go about it. So with Pliovar, it was clear that what the modelers wanted for one of our outputs was they really wanted to be able to map temperature, and I mean really map it. Like every site needed to have its lat long because they needed to be able to compare directly to their model grid squares and to overlay our data on maps. But something that they also really needed was the uncertainty in those measurements. So data model comparison is not always just, well, it looks okay. Sometimes it is by how much do we overestimate or underestimate different processes, and how far can the model be pushed to match the data. So if we just put some data sets out with no uncertainty, and it aligned with the model, that seemed fine, and where it didn't, then you just get questions like, well, is it your data? And then the data people say, well, is it your model? So if you show the uncertainty, then you can see the kind of broader target that the models have to aim for. But I think there's also now certainly in paleoclimate, there are new transient models now emerging as well, where they look at different data over time. And for those, they also really need to know the uncertainty in the age control as well, and the age uncertainty. So this all comes back to your metadata, I think, as well. What calibration did you use? What age depth model did you use? How well constrained is it? But I think also consider what the modelers also want to use the data for, or why you want to use data model. I've done data model comparison before where I just wanted to know whether it got wetter or drier, because that might explain my ocean circulation change. And for that, we didn't actually need to do any physical data model comparison. It was just have a look at the data and then look at a map and look at the core, and that was fine. Whereas for the Pliovar, we were actually putting them together, which required more of that uncertainty to be in place.
Nikita, do you want to?
Yeah, just building on what Erin said as well. I think with data model, it was kind of interesting. So I would say first, it's not your job. Like, it's not your job to be doing the data set in a way that it is easy for modelers. By that, I just mean that it's kind of a two-way process. Like, you cannot do this gift wrap package that you can give them where they can directly use it for model comparisons. You kind of have to involve them from the outset going. Like, a lot of people from the community are going to put in a lot of work so that you have this real measured world data for the last glacial maxima for Lig, because there is no other data. There's no instrumental data, no satellite data. There's no other data for those time periods except what you get from paleoclimate records. And so it becomes a bit of, you engage modelers since the very beginning. So when you're building your database structure, like Erin said, you ask them, what do you want to compare? So for stalagmites, it became they wanted to compare oxygen isotopes against rainfall oxygen isotopes, because isotope-enabled models, that's what they could produce. And you take away this uncertainty around the interpretation. You're just comparing sort of apples to apples. In that sense, oxygen isotopes from stalagmites to oxygen isotopes in rainfall in the model. So that's the level at which we needed to give them. We didn't need to engage with the interpretation of the oxygen isotope. So that was already helpful to know. But then taking them through, like, oh, you still have to convert calcium carbonate oxygen isotopes to rainwater equivalent. They can be these different equations. They can have these different uncertainties. When you're looking for data, look for it within lat-longitude grids rather than based on the name of this one author that you know that does work on stalagmites, that has one stalagmite from the top of the Tibetan plateau, because it's not going to be a good comparison. So it really becomes this from the outset of building the database to writing that data model comparison paper. You really need the two communities to keep talking to each other and seeing that everything is making sense on both sides. And I would say it's both ways, like working groups like Flyover, SciSal, 2K, they do a lot of work to make the data accessible for models. You want to make sure there is the other way as well. So for example, if I do want to look at a single stalagmite from India, I also want to be able to access model output data, which is not often accessible for paleo researchers. It's not that it's not out there, it's just, it takes some coding. You need to understand the models, which we don't really do because it's not our field. So it's nice if the communities at the outset are kind of talking to each other and helping each other through both and keeping that two-way thing kind of open. But yeah, I think Erin covered all of the other points.
Okay, yeah, it's a two-way relationship. Yeah, it's a good point. Jon, do you want to sort of chip in from the sort of computational side on this sort of data model?
The more modeling perspective. So kind of to emphasize what Erin said, include uncertainties is like just the most important thing from a modeling perspective, particularly if you want to look at the uncertainty in your model as well and what the kind of range of outcomes are. If you've got no uncertainty in your input measurements, then you just can't do that. And, you know, effectively, you've got no constraint on your model at all, really, if you don't have uncertainties. Kind of thinking about what you both said as well, making sure you have a conversation with the people you're talking to, that you want to be working with for modeling, obviously very important. If you have tools that you use to kind of transform one bit of data to another, consider making them open source. So if you have code which might help out the modelers understand or work with your data, put it on a GitHub repository or something and make sure they can use it. Ultimately, you want to try and minimize the amount of work that each of you have to do to work with each other. So if you've got code which can help the modelers, that's great. And then if they've got stuff that can help you, there should be a conversation going there. And that should extend not just to exchange of data, but to exchange of methods as well. So yeah, from my perspective, I think the most important things are just talking with the people you're actually working with and trying to share as much as you can, not just data.
Yeah, somewhat refreshing points in this day and age of computerization. Talk to people. So that's great. Our hour is up. So if any of the three of you need to jump off now, then go for it. If not, I'll just ask you to give one final tip, one final suggestion for let's say you've got a PhD student in sort of geochemistry of some form. What's your sort of take-home tip for what they can do to make their lives easier or to make their science better in this kind of area? Nikita, maybe you want to start.
I mean, it's fun. Like I really enjoyed the fieldwork. I really enjoyed the lab work, the data reduction, all of it. But I know that somewhere for me, I felt nicer doing all of it, knowing that it wouldn't stay in my PhD thesis, but it would be the PhD thesis, which I could write as a book, which I wanted to do. It would go to the publication. I would make it accessible to the working group. It would then be used for data model comparisons. It would be used for regional review papers. Like, it was satisfying to know that the hours and hours and hours that I spent on doing fieldwork and all of this meticulous lab work and noting down metadata and doing all of that went a lot beyond my individual PhD thesis. So it's just one of these things going when you're in a basement lab and you're doing this, just think of it that way. It's going to go much further than just your thesis, which is a really nice way of seeing it.
Yeah, it's a lovely point. It's a great point. Yeah. Erin, let's go with you.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think something I say to my students here as well a lot is to be kind to your future self. So in 6 months' time, when you look at the data, you need to be able to understand what you have done. So taking notes and making sure that everything's clear. That's the metadata which will also really help future users take advantage and really use and enjoy working with your data. So look after yourselves. And so I have so many spreadsheets with text and colors. I don't remember why I colored them that way. really, just take care, take the notes, and then know that will all be really valuable for future users, and they will really appreciate your work as well as you will.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And Jon, and last but not least, let's see what your final suggestion would be.
Yeah, mine would be similar on the lines of looking after your future self, which is to kind of think about how you're going to do something and then stick to it. Make sure you have a kind of protocol in place which will determine how you collect your data, how you write your data, how you work with your data in future. Think about that in detail to begin with, and then the process of actually doing it is a lot easier than kind of making it up on the fly. I'm speaking from past experience. During my PhD, I did pretty much everything on the fly, and it was awful. And I ended up taking 4 years to write my PhD rather than 3.5. So definitely kind of think really carefully about how you're going to structure everything. Ideally, automate as much as you can so that you don't have to actually think about it. You can just do it, get on with it, automatically done. You can think about more important things. And finally, learn how to code if you don't already, because it's just, especially as well, if you want to move into a different field after your PhD, maybe you want to move into modeling, maybe you want to work in industry. It's just an incredibly useful transferable skill.
Thanks, Jon. Yeah, so yeah, there's a few good points there for me to take home from this as well, I think, for all of us, basically, because some of these suggestions are things that we've failed to do properly the first time when we've gone through these. So hopefully, a few of you that are seeing this can do a slightly better job first time around and finish your PhD a month or two earlier. So thanks so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you for all the questions that people sent in. I'm sorry we couldn't get through quite all of them, but we've pretty much covered the themes of all of your questions. And thanks so much to our 3 panelists for taking the time to join us. And it's been lots of useful information and quite a lot of fun. So thank you very much. I hope to see some of you at the GGREP meeting in Durham in a few weeks' time now. And if not, I hope to see some people at our next online ECR Skills session. So have a lovely afternoon and a lovely weekend.